The rain had let up just enough for the clouds to scatter, leaving behind a damp chill that clung to Lucas Hayes as he stepped out of his truck. He adjusted the collar of his flannel shirt and took a long breath, the cold Oregon air biting the inside of his lungs. The gravel lot outside the Bend Animal Rescue Center crunched under his boots as he made his way toward the entrance, the building's red wooden siding glistening slightly under the recent drizzle. Lucas hadn't planned on coming today. In fact, he'd avoided this place for 2 years. Ever since Bailey, his golden retriever of nearly a decade, passed in the middle of a quiet February night, Lucas had sworn off the idea of another dog. Losing her had carved a hollow space inside him, one no therapy session or sketchbook could seem to fill. But grief, like winter in the Northwest, always lingered longer than it should. And lately, that silence at home had started to feel too loud. The lobby was small but warm, the faint scent of coffee mingling with disinfectant. A young woman at the front desk greeted him with a polite nod as he signed in. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, glancing around at the flyers on the corkboard: lost pets, training sessions, senior dog adoption drives. "You looking for a pup or just visiting?" asked a voice beside him. Lucas turned to see a middle-aged man in a weathered hoodie, wiping his hands on a towel. "Not sure," Lucas said. "Thought I'd just take a look." The man nodded knowingly. Sometimes the right one finds you before you even know you're ready. Lucas offered a tight smile and followed him past the front desk into the hallway lined with kennels. Barking erupted as they passed, the high-pitched yaps of terriers, the low woofs of labs, tails thudding against chain link. Then they stopped at Kennel 14. "This one's been here a while," the man said. "Doesn't make a fuss. Doesn't get much attention either." Lucas looked through the metal bars. A large, shaggy dog sat still in the far corner, unmoving, eyes locked onto his. One cloudy, one gold. No bark. No wag. Just watching. Something in Lucas's chest shifted. Not a pang. Not quite a pull. Just something. And for the first time in 2 years, he didn't look away. Lucas crouched slowly in front of the kennel, careful not to startle the dog. The cold from the concrete floor seeped through his jeans, but he barely noticed. The dog didn't flinch, didn't move at all, just sat there like a statue carved out of matted fur and fatigue. Up close, Lucas could see the details better. The dog's coat was a wild, unkempt mix of black, gray, and dusty tan, tangled in places and worn thin in others. The fur around its ears was longer, like old fringe on a winter hat, while the patches along his sides were rough and uneven. One eye, cloudy and bluish, spoke of age or injury. The other, a sharp, almost startling amber, stared directly into Lucas's. "What's his name?" Lucas asked, not looking away. The man with the hoodie shrugged. "Came in with a tag that just says Scout. No microchip. No background. Nothing." "Scout," Lucas repeated under his breath, testing the sound of it. It didn't feel like just a name. It felt like a word someone had once said with love. He leaned in a little closer, careful to stay just outside the bars. The dog didn't growl, didn't whimper. Just kept watching. Not with fear. Not even with caution. There was something else in that gaze. Curiosity, maybe. Or memory. Then Lucas saw the tag. A small brass disc, dulled with age, hung from the collar like an old coin. He squinted to read it. The words, though worn, were still clear. "If you're reading this, I was loved once." Lucas swallowed hard. He didn't know why, but that sentence hit something deep, deeper than he'd expected. It was simple, even sweet, but there was a weight in it. A history. Someone had written those words, not for a vet or a shelter, but for a stranger. For him, maybe. "Poor guy," the man said quietly. "He's not aggressive, just disconnected." Lucas nodded faintly but didn't answer. His thoughts were 100 miles away. Or maybe just 2 years ago, back when Bailey would curl up beside his sketchpad, her breathing the only sound in the room. "Can I take him outside?" Lucas asked. The man looked surprised. "You sure?" Lucas kept his eyes on the dog. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." The adoption paperwork took less time than Lucas expected. Maybe that's how it went with older dogs: no long interviews, no puppy care guides, just a few signatures and a quiet understanding. Scout didn't resist when the man clipped on a leash. He stood slowly, limbs stiff like an old man getting out of bed, and walked out of the kennel without a sound. The hallway quieted as they passed. Even the barking from the other dogs seemed to fade. Scout didn't sniff around or pull ahead. He just walked beside Lucas, matching his steps like they'd done this before. Outside, the afternoon had turned bright and cold, the kind of early spring day where the sky looks washed clean but the ground still remembers winter. Lucas opened the passenger door of his truck. "Up you go," he said softly. Scout paused, looking at the seat, then back at Lucas. "You're not that heavy," Lucas added, offering a small grin. "I've carried heavier." Without a sound, Scout climbed in and curled up tight, his back to the door, chin resting near the center console. Lucas hesitated before shutting the door, like something about the moment needed more time than it was getting. The drive home was quiet. Lucas didn't turn on the radio. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the soft rhythm of Scout's breathing. Every so often, Lucas glanced over. Scout didn't move. Didn't fidget. Just lay there like this was already his routine. Back at the house, Lucas pulled into the gravel driveway, the tires crunching under the weight of the truck. His small green craftsman-style home sat at the edge of the woods, pine needles dusting the roof, the porch lined with firewood. It was the same house where Bailey had spent her final days. Where silence had settled like dust. Lucas opened the door and waited. Scout climbed down slowly, sniffing the air once before following him up the steps. Inside, Lucas left the front door open for light and stood back to let Scout explore. The dog made a slow, quiet loop of the living room, sniffing the corner by the fireplace, the old armchair, the edge of the couch. Then he stopped in front of a round cushion on the floor. Bailey's old bed. Still washed and fluffed, as if Lucas had always expected someone else to use it someday. "You can have it," Lucas said. "I kept it clean." Scout stepped onto the bed, circled once, then again, and finally sank into it with a long, weary sigh. Not tired. Not relieved. Just settled. Lucas sat down on the couch, watching him. No tail wag. No bark. Just silence between two beings who didn't know each other yet, but also didn't feel quite like strangers. That night, Scout didn't whine. Didn't pace. Just slept. And for the first time in a long while, so did Lucas. The first few days passed like a quiet snowfall, gentle, uneventful, but leaving a mark nonetheless. Scout didn't demand much. He didn't bark for food or scratch at doors. He simply watched, listened, and followed. Lucas noticed it right away, how the dog always seemed to be nearby, not clinging but present. He'd sit just outside the bathroom, wait near the garage, and walk alongside Lucas on their morning loops around the block, leash slack the whole way. Mornings became predictable. Lucas would get up around 7, make coffee, and scramble eggs, 2 for him, 1 for Scout. The dog never begged. He'd just sit by the back door, tail tucked neatly around his paws, and wait until the food hit the bowl before approaching. It was the kind of quiet patience that felt more human than canine. One afternoon, Lucas decided it was time for a bath. Scout didn't resist. He stood still in the tub, blinking as warm water rinsed months of grime from his coat. Underneath the mats and mud, a golden brown emerged, thick, soft, streaked with patches of white around his chest and muzzle. He looked 10 pounds lighter afterward, like someone shedding more than just dirt. "You clean up nice," Lucas muttered, towel-drying his head. "Still not a fan of the name, Scout, but I guess you don't mind." Scout blinked slowly in response, then wandered over to the heater vent and lay down with a soft grunt. That night, Lucas pulled out a cardboard box from the hallway closet. Inside were old things: Bailey's leash, a faded bandana, some photographs. He sifted through them absent-mindedly until his hand found a worn tennis ball. He rolled it across the hardwood floor. Scout lifted his head, watched the ball bounce to a stop near the rug, then looked at Lucas. For a moment, Lucas assumed he'd ignore it. But then, Scout stood up, walked over, nudged the ball gently with his nose, and rolled it back. Lucas blinked. Then he laughed, a full, surprised laugh that echoed off the quiet walls. Scout tilted his head. "Okay," Lucas said, still smiling. "So you do know how to play." After that, the house didn't feel so still. The quiet was still there, but it no longer felt hollow. Lucas caught himself talking out loud more often, about what to cook, which chores to do, even commenting on the shows they watched. Scout didn't respond, of course, but he listened. Always listened. He'd lie at Lucas's feet during dinner, wait patiently by the door when it was time for a walk, and curl into his bed by the fireplace each night without being told. Lucas didn't know exactly when it happened, but somewhere between a morning coffee and an evening stroll, they'd fallen into rhythm. Not just man and dog. Something steadier. Something healing. It was a quiet Thursday morning when Lucas found himself staring at the brass tag again. Scout lay curled in his usual spot by the fireplace, his breathing slow, his tail occasionally thumping against the floor when the heat kicked on. Lucas had just refilled his coffee and sat on the couch with the tag dangling from his fingers, turning it slowly between his thumb and forefinger. The words hadn't changed: "If you're reading this, I was loved once." But now they felt heavier, more insistent, like they weren't just meant to be read, but understood. Lucas flipped the tag over, something he hadn't thought to do before. At first glance, the back looked completely worn down, just scratches and time. But as he tilted it toward the morning light, faint marks began to catch the sun. Not random after all. Letters. Numbers. An address. Lucas stood so fast he nearly spilled his coffee. Grabbing his phone, he tapped the address into the Maps app. The location popped up: a farmhouse about 20 miles northeast, just past Redmond. Not far, but far enough to wonder. He glanced over at Scout. The dog was still resting, but one amber eye was open now, watching him. "You've been somewhere," Lucas said quietly. "Maybe it's time we go back." By noon, the truck was loaded with a blanket, a bowl, and a thermos of coffee. Scout stepped in without hesitation. The air outside was crisp and clean, sun filtering through tall pine trees as they drove out of town. The route took them along the edges of rural Oregon, narrow roads flanked by wide pastures, barns weathered from decades of rain and snow, pickup trucks parked under rusting carports. The address led them down a long gravel drive, lined with cottonwoods just beginning to bud. The house at the end was modest, its white paint faded but not peeling, the porch sagging just slightly in the middle. A wind chime clinked softly in the breeze. An older man stepped out onto the porch, leaning heavily on a cane. His gray sweater looked handmade. His eyes, sharp beneath heavy brows, narrowed slightly as the truck came to a stop. Lucas climbed out slowly. "Afternoon," he called. "Sorry to bother you. I'm looking for someone who might have owned a dog named Scout. I found this address on his tag." The man didn't speak at first. Just stood there, eyes fixed on the passenger side of the truck. "He's got one cloudy eye," Lucas added. "Kind of a shaggy coat." The man's expression shifted. Not shock, recognition. And then, just one word. Tucker? Inside the truck, Scout sat up. And for the first time since Lucas had brought him home, he let out a low, quiet whine. Lucas opened the passenger door, and Scout, Tucker, jumped down more quickly than usual. He landed with a soft thud, hesitated for a second, then began walking toward the porch. His tail wasn't wagging, but it wasn't tucked either. Just level. Steady. Focused. The old man stepped off the last stair, lowering himself carefully to one knee, letting his cane fall beside him in the grass. He didn't say anything. Didn't reach out. Just waited. Scout came to a stop in front of him. He sniffed once, then leaned in. The man's hands, knotted, trembling, buried themselves in Scout's fur. A breath escaped him like a dam breaking. "My God," he whispered. "You came back." Lucas stood silently by the truck, unsure whether to approach or give them space. He didn't know exactly what this was, but it felt sacred. Like something lost had just been returned, if only for a moment. After a long stretch of silence, the man stood with effort, still resting one hand on Scout's back. "Name's Walter," he said, looking toward Lucas. "Walter Bishop. That dog belonged to my son. His name was Ethan." Lucas nodded slowly, walking over. "I'm Lucas Hayes. I adopted him a few weeks ago. He's been, well, different. Quiet. Kind of distant, at first. But steady. That tag, it got me thinking. I didn't know it would lead to something like this." Walter looked down at Scout. "He used to be called Tucker. Ethan picked that name when he was 20. Said it sounded loyal." "What happened?" Lucas asked softly. Walter's jaw clenched. His gaze wandered out toward the fields behind the house. "Ethan passed 4 years ago. Motorcycle accident. He and Tucker went everywhere together. After Ethan died, I tried to keep him. But I wasn't well. I was angry, broken. He ran off one day and never came back. I assumed he was gone. Figured maybe that was his way of grieving." Lucas swallowed hard. "He's been at the shelter for a long time. Nobody wanted him." Walter nodded slowly. "He was loved, once," he said, repeating the words on the tag. "That was Ethan's doing. He had it made just in case Tucker ever got lost. Said he wanted whoever found him to know he wasn't just another stray." Lucas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the tag, handing it to Walter. The older man turned it over in his palm, thumb tracing the words. "Thank you," Walter said quietly. "For not giving up on him." Lucas looked at Scout, who had laid down now, one paw stretched forward, head resting on the porch step. He didn't seem torn or confused. Just peaceful. "I didn't do much," Lucas said. "He kind of saved me, too." Walter looked at him, eyes misted but steady. "That's what my son used to say." The three of them sat together on the porch as the wind moved through the cottonwoods like a whisper. The idea came quietly, the way good ideas often do, no lightning bolt, no dramatic music. Just a moment. Lucas was brushing Scout one evening, the dog's coat now softer and fuller after weeks of care. A local news segment played in the background, featuring a group of therapy dogs visiting a children's hospital. One of the anchors said something that stuck, "Sometimes the quietest comfort speaks the loudest." Lucas looked down at Scout. "You'd be good at that," he murmured. Scout blinked, then closed his eyes, leaning gently into the brush stroke. That night, Lucas stayed up reading about therapy dog programs in Central Oregon. There was one orientation scheduled for the following weekend at a community center downtown. No pressure. Just an evaluation to see how a dog responded to stimuli, wheelchairs, walkers, children's voices, dropped objects. Lucas signed up before he could talk himself out of it. The center was bright but low-key. Chairs lined the perimeter. Soft jazz played over a portable speaker. A woman with silver hair and cherry-red glasses welcomed them both at the door. "You must be Scout," she said, then turned to Lucas. "And the gentleman behind the leash?" "Lucas. We're first-timers." She smiled. "Most of the great ones are." They spent the next hour walking through mock therapy scenarios. Scout never flinched, not at the vacuum hum, not when a clipboard hit the floor, not even when a boy in a wheelchair rolled toward him with squeaky wheels and extended a hand. Scout simply sat, leaned in slightly, and rested his chin on the boy's lap. "He's a natural," one of the evaluators whispered. Lucas didn't reply. He just watched. At the end of the session, they were handed a pamphlet with a list of partner organizations, schools, libraries, retirement homes, support groups. Lucas looked at the paper, then at Scout, who now sat by the exit like he'd done this a dozen times. "Ready for the next chapter?" Lucas asked quietly. Scout didn't move. But his tail thumped once, slow and certain. That was enough. Their first official visit was at the Bend Public Library. It was part of a Saturday morning reading program designed for children with anxiety or speech challenges. The concept was simple: kids would read out loud to therapy dogs who, unlike adults or classmates, wouldn't judge, correct, or interrupt. Just listen. Lucas and Scout were directed to a corner with bean bags, low bookshelves, and a carpet shaped like a giant leaf. Scout walked in calmly, sniffed the edge of the rug, and lay down without being prompted. His tail rested along his side, motionless but relaxed, as if signaling, "I'm here, and I'm staying." A boy named Caleb was their first reader. 7 years old, slight frame, eyes darting beneath thick glasses. He held a paperback book in his lap with trembling hands. His mother sat a few feet away, giving him space. Scout blinked slowly and lay his head near Caleb's shoe. I like dogs," Caleb said softly. Lucas smiled. "Then Scout's a good place to start. He's a pro at listening." Caleb began to read. His voice stumbled over longer words, pausing often, but Scout didn't move. Not even a flick of the ear. And by the 4th page, something changed. Caleb's shoulders dropped, his voice steadied, and by the end of the session, he was reading aloud like he didn't care who was listening. He really was listening, wasn't he? Caleb whispered at the end, running a small hand down Scout's back. "Every word," Lucas said. Midweek, they visited Maple Oaks Senior Home. Scout had a different energy there, more cautious, more deliberate. The air was slower in that place, filled with soft coughs, the low hum of televisions, and the occasional squeak of wheelchairs. One resident, George, sat by a large window overlooking the courtyard. He didn't speak or acknowledge their presence at first. But Scout didn't mind. He simply walked over, sat beside George's chair, and leaned gently against his leg. George didn't look down. Didn't say a word. But he didn't move away either. They stayed that way for almost the entire visit. As they were leaving, one of the nurses pulled Lucas aside. "George hasn't let anyone sit near him in months," she said. "That dog, he got through somehow." Lucas looked back at Scout, now walking slowly beside him. He realized something then: Scout wasn't doing anything special. No tricks. No wagging. Just being there. And somehow, that was more than enough. It always was. The changes came quietly, almost respectfully, as if time itself was trying not to be cruel. Scout began to move a little slower in the mornings, his first few steps stiff, like gears warming up after a cold night. He still rose when Lucas did, still followed him to the kitchen, but the spring in his stride had dulled. Lucas didn't say anything at first. Maybe he didn't want to admit it. Maybe he was hoping it would pass. By mid-October, Scout had taken to napping more often, under the dining table, near the baseboard heater, by the front door where he could catch the afternoon light. He no longer jumped into the truck on his own. Lucas would lift him gently, one arm under his chest, the other supporting his back legs. Scout never protested. He simply leaned into the help, trusting. One morning, Lucas noticed that Scout had stopped following him from room to room. He still lifted his head when Lucas moved, still watched him leave and return, but he didn't bother to get up anymore. Not out of disinterest, just knowing. Like he'd learned that some moments didn't require movement to be meaningful. At the library, Scout remained a steady presence, but he stood up less frequently, letting the kids come to him instead. Caleb, now more confident, read chapter books without hesitation, curling up beside Scout and whispering lines into his fur like secrets. At Maple Oaks, George had started saving a spot by the window with an extra cushion, one Scout gladly accepted, letting the old man rest a hand on his back for entire visits without either of them speaking a word. Lucas began to adapt, adjusting their routine. Walks grew shorter, time on the porch longer. He bought a thicker rug for Scout to lie on and started mixing in soft food with his kibble. On colder mornings, he wrapped him in a fleece blanket before his nap. But it wasn't all decline. Some days, Scout surprised him, a faster walk to the mailbox, a tail wag when Lucas played guitar, a sudden spark in his eye when a squirrel darted across the yard. The old dog was still in there, still showing up, just in a quieter, gentler way. Lucas didn't say it aloud, but he knew. The days ahead were growing shorter, not just in sunlight, but in number. So he made each one count. And Scout, in his own silent way, did too. The last morning began like any other, which made it harder to recognize for what it was. The sun hadn't yet crested the trees when Lucas stirred, the faint gray light of dawn brushing the edges of the bedroom. For a few seconds, he lay still, listening. The house was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the wall clock in the kitchen and the steady hum of the baseboard heater warming the floorboards. Then he remembered. Scout had chosen to sleep at the foot of the bed the night before, a spot he hadn't returned to in weeks. Lucas had woken once during the night to feel the weight of a head on his ankle, a warmth he hadn't realized he'd missed until it came back. He sat up slowly, careful not to jostle him. Scout was still there, curled tightly, his fur rising and falling with each shallow breath. His nose twitched slightly, as if caught in some gentle dream. One paw stretched out in front of him, resting just past the edge of the blanket, like he had one foot in the hallway, one in the memory of movement. Lucas reached down and placed a hand gently on his side. Still warm. Still breathing. But slower. He didn't speak at first. Just sat with him, letting his fingers trace the familiar lines of Scout's frame, the dip behind his shoulders, the soft fur under his ear, the curve of his spine now more pronounced with age. "I'm right here," Lucas whispered eventually. "You don't have to get up today." Scout's eyes fluttered open, the cloudy one still unfocused, the amber one locking briefly with Lucas's. A blink. A breath. Then he closed them again. Lucas stayed beside him as the sun slowly filled the room, light stretching across the floor like a quiet invitation. Outside, the trees swayed gently, their branches casting soft shadows on the wall. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. Scout didn't react. Eventually, his breathing grew even slower. Then stopped. No twitch. No sound. No long final sigh. Just stillness. Lucas didn't cry right away. Grief, like love, didn't always come on cue. Instead, he sat there with one hand on Scout's side, still feeling for movement that wasn't there. When he finally stood, he moved with purpose. He lifted Scout gently, the way he had so many times before, and carried him outside into the crisp autumn air. The porch was quiet. The wind moved through the pine trees in hushed tones, as if the world knew to keep its voice low. Under the old pine tree at the edge of the yard, the one Scout had always watched from the porch, Lucas had prepared a spot days ago. Not because he expected this morning, but because he knew one would come. He wrapped Scout in the soft fleece blanket he always loved, the one that smelled like home and firewood and long naps. Beside him, Lucas placed the worn brass tag. "If you're reading this, I was loved once." And beneath it, on a small stone he had carved himself, "and loved again." He covered the grave slowly, carefully, patting down the earth with quiet hands. No rush. No need. When he finished, he sat beside it for a long time, his coffee going cold in the thermos, the morning warming around him. The wind rustled the branches, and for just a moment, Lucas swore he could hear the faint click of paws on the porch steps. But when he turned, there was only light. Only peace. And in that silence, he understood. Scout hadn't left. He had simply rested. In the weeks that followed, the house felt quieter, but not empty. Lucas still woke early, made 2 eggs, though only ate 1, and poured coffee for 1. Scout's bed remained by the fireplace, undisturbed. His bowl stayed by the kitchen wall, not because Lucas forgot to put it away, but because he wasn't ready to. The silence that filled the space wasn't hollow. It was full of memories, of presence, of a dog who never needed to speak to be heard. Lucas continued their routine alone, visiting the library on Saturdays, Maple Oaks on Wednesdays. The staff at both places asked quietly, gently, about Scout. Some cried, others just nodded and looked away. Lucas brought a journal with him now, letting people write their own memories in it. Children drew pictures, seniors scribbled thank you notes, and one young girl wrote, "He made me feel like I mattered, even when I couldn't say why." The journal grew heavier with each visit. One day, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Caleb's mother. Caleb still reads out loud at home. He says it helps him feel close to Scout. He's reading more than he ever has. Thank you, for bringing him a listener when he needed one. Another came from Maple Oaks, handwritten in uneven cursive. It was from George. Scout reminded me how to sit still and not feel forgotten. That's a gift I didn't know I needed. Thank you. Lucas added both letters to what he now called the Scout wall, a small corner of his living room where he'd placed Scout's tag, the cushion from George, drawings from the library kids, and the photo Walter had given him of Ethan and Tucker, Scout's first life. Each piece hung like a thread in a tapestry, stitched together by quiet moments of connection. One afternoon, Lucas received a wooden carving in the mail. It was a small dog, tail curled, eyes closed in rest. It came with a note. For the dog who listened. From someone who needed to be heard. He placed it beside the others and lit a small candle. Outside, the wind rustled the pine branches, the same way it always had. Lucas opened a fresh journal and wrote on the first page. Scout didn't just change lives. He connected them. With silence, with patience, with presence. He showed us that sometimes, the quietest soul leaves the loudest echo. And then, for a long while, he just sat, alone, but not alone, listening to the peace that Scout had left behind. Scout's story reminds us that love doesn't always arrive with excitement or noise. Sometimes, it comes in silence, in patience, in simply being there. In a world that often moves too fast, he showed us how to slow down, to listen, and to connect without words. His quiet presence changed lives, not through grand gestures, but through gentle moments of care. The lesson is simple but powerful: everyone, no matter how old, quiet, or overlooked, has value. Sometimes, all someone needs is a second chance, and someone willing to see beyond what's on the surface. If this story touched your heart, imagine how many more animals like Scout are out there, waiting to be seen, waiting to be loved again. If you believe in the healing power of companionship, and in the beauty of stories where animals help us become better humans, don't forget to subscribe to Paw Prints and Stories. We bring you emotional, true-to-life tales that celebrate the bond between animals and people. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and help us share these stories of hope, love, and second chances. Because sometimes, the quietest stories are the ones that matter most.